The surgeon paid for an elderly woman at a restaurant who was laughed at by the entire staff. The next morning, the restaurant director received a phone call. The rays of the scorching sun shimmered with silver glints across the smooth surface of the sea. Seagulls cried monotonously. Antonio squinted, gazing at the sparkling expanse. Moving to a resort town with its heat and pervasive scent of salty breeze seemed like a crazy step to many of his acquaintances, but Antonio knew it was exactly what he needed right now. Just over 3 months ago, the young surgeon had left the capital, fleeing from endless operations and sleepless nights, and now lived and worked at a small seaside resort. Antonio was tired of the constant strain and the feeling that life was passing him by while he was in the operating room. He was tired of returning to a cold, lonely house where no one awaited him. He was tired of being a tiny grain of sand in a vast metropolis. Here, on the shore of the endless sea, Antonio felt different. Instead of endless skyscrapers and indifferent subways, he was surrounded by blooming gardens and the aroma of freshly baked bread. Opening the office window, he heard the whisper of the waves and the rustle of pebbles. In this new place, Antonio was not just a highly skilled surgeon but also an ordinary person who had time to stop and take a deep breath to notice the beauty around him. In the small, bright, and very cozy clinic where he worked, it smelled of eucalyptus and the sea. Antonio took his time with each patient, for the first time in his life, not rushing anywhere. He realized he could give people not only health but also a bit of warmth from his soul. This feeling was new to the doctor. People greeted him on the streets, which surprised and delighted Antonio. In the evenings, he sat on the balcony of the room he rented in one of the guest houses and enjoyed the beautiful view of the sunset over the sea. Gazing at the gradually fading turquoise, he felt a sense of peace and happiness. For the first time in a long while, he felt at home. After work, he enjoyed going to the same little restaurant nearby. The restaurant's decor featured lemon yellow and turquoise colors, and the walls were adorned with photographs of tanned, smiling fishermen. The windows overlooked a blooming street and a quiet harbor. The restaurant had an excellent chef who prepared the world's best seafood pasta, and the waitstaff was always polite and friendly with Antonio. He would sit at his favorite table by the window and watch the town's life through the glass. Watching the boys playing by the fountain, he would recall his own childhood and even envy them a little. When Antonio saw young couples walking hand in hand, he would sigh and quickly avert his gaze. The feeling of loneliness, though slightly eased by his move to the sea, still occasionally made itself known. He wished to meet a kindred spirit with whom he could converse on various topics or simply remain silent, feeling a sense of unity and trust. But such a person had not yet appeared in his life. One Friday, Antonio decided to visit his favorite restaurant to relax after a long work week. As usual, he was warmly greeted, shown to his table, and given a menu. Antonio decided to treat himself to something special and completely new, so he began to peruse the dishes with interest. He was so engrossed that he did not immediately hear the laughter and whispered comments of the waitstaff who were observing someone intently. The person they were observing was an elderly woman who awkwardly stumbled into the restaurant and, without waiting for an invitation, went to one of the tables. A young waiter tried to stop her, but she stubbornly made her way to the far wall, choosing the best spot for herself. "Madam, but this table is reserved," the young man exclaimed. "Of course," the woman confidently nodded. "I reserved it this morning." Laughter erupted. Other restaurant staff found it amusing for some reason. The waiter tried to protest, but the woman refused to listen. She asked for the menu, and another girl, barely suppressing her laughter, handed it to her. "Please bring me lobsters and a glass of champagne," the woman said. Another burst of laughter followed. "Sorry, but we don't have lobsters today," said the waitress who had given the woman the menu. "Can I offer you something else?" "But how can that be?" the woman wondered. "I think they were recently added to the red list," the waitress joked. The woman looked at her in such confusion that Antonio, who had momentarily looked away from the menu and was now watching the scene with amazement, felt sorry for her. He scrutinized the woman. She looked about 60 and was dressed quite decently. Antonio couldn't understand what exactly was causing the young restaurant staff's amusement. Finally, he decided to call one of the waiters and quietly asked, "Could you tell me why you're laughing at this woman? It seems like it upsets her." The young man leaned closer to his table and answered, "You see, she's completely crazy. She comes here a couple of times a month and acts like a queen. Orders the most expensive dishes and champagne, and then doesn't pay?" Antonio guessed. "Exactly," the waiter nodded. "She says her father will come soon and pay the bill." "That can't be," Antonio exclaimed. "But unfortunately, that's what happens," the waiter complained. "I'm telling you, this woman has lost her mind." Antonio glanced again at the elderly woman. She seemed perfectly normal. But the waiter couldn't be making it up. Antonio was about to look away when something made his heart skip a beat. At that very moment, the woman was almost in tears, convincing the waitress that her father would soon appear at the door. "I understand everything, but I can't do anything," the waitress repeated monotonously. Antonio couldn't bear it any longer and got up from his table. He approached the girl and softly whispered in her ear, "Bring everything that this woman ordered. I will pay her bill." The waitress raised her eyebrows in surprise. "All right, sir," she nodded and went to the kitchen. Antonio gave the elderly woman an embarrassed smile and returned to his place. He placed his order and occasionally glanced toward the table where the strange guest was sitting. He saw her receive her dishes, thank the waitress heartily, and then happily begin her meal. This woman really doesn't look poor. She must have been brought up in a very respectable family, Antonio thought to himself. She probably does have some issues with her mind. The waiter brought his order, and the man began to dine leisurely. He saw the elderly woman finish her meal, carefully wipe her mouth with a napkin, thank the waitress, and dignifiedly leave the table and head for the door. The restaurant staff exchanged meaningful glances and smiles as they watched her leave. Antonio finished his dinner and asked for the check. He paid for everything he had eaten, as well as for the dishes ordered by the elderly guest. Then he got up and, deciding to take a walk along the sea, headed for the promenade. 15 minutes later, he had completely forgotten about the strange woman he had observed at the restaurant. The next day, Antonio slept in and got up only around noon. He took a shower, brushed his teeth, and decided to go out for breakfast. To his surprise, his feet led him to the same little restaurant he had visited the day before. Antonio walked inside. At this hour, the dining room was almost empty. He sat at his favorite table, and immediately, the same waitress who had served the elderly woman the day before came over. "We're glad to see you again, sir. What would you like to order today?" Antonio checked the menu and asked for a croissant with salmon and a cappuccino. The waitress nodded and was about to leave when she suddenly slapped her forehead. "Sir, I'm so sorry, I completely forgot to tell you something," the girl exclaimed. "What is it?" Antonio asked, concerned. He wasn't fond of surprises. "Do you remember the woman you paid for yesterday?" she asked. Antonio nodded. "Of course. How could I forget?" he replied. "Well," the waitress began, "this morning, the director of our restaurant received an unexpected phone call. A young woman called, introduced herself as the daughter of that lady, and wanted to know if she needed to pay her mother's bill because she learned from a friend that the elderly woman had dined here yesterday." "And what did the director say?" Antonio inquired politely. He didn't know what to say, the girl admitted. "Fortunately, I was nearby and explained to him that one of our regular customers, meaning you, had paid her bill." "How kind of you," Antonio smiled. The waitress returned his smile and continued. "The director passed on my words to the elderly woman's daughter, and she was so touched that she wanted to meet you and thank you in person." "Are you serious?" Antonio asked, not quite believing it. "Yes, of course," the waitress nodded. "She left her number and asked us to give it to you the next time you came in." With that, the girl asked for a moment and hurried to the back room. A couple of minutes later, she returned with a torn piece of paper from a notebook, hastily scribbled with a phone number. Adriana was written below the numbers. Antonio felt a strange sensation. He was modest and didn't want to seek out compliments, but something inside him urged him to call the stranger. Summoning his courage, Antonio dialed the number. A pleasant female voice answered almost immediately. "Good afternoon," the man began. "My name is Antonio, and I'm calling you from the restaurant where your mother had dinner last night. I paid her bill." "Oh, I'm so glad you called," the girl exclaimed. "My name is Adriana, and it's very nice to meet you. If you don't mind, I would like to meet you in person and thank you for what you did." "Oh, it's such a small thing," Antonio wanted to say, but something stopped him. He suddenly felt a strong desire to see the woman he had spoken to on the phone in person. "All right," he replied, somewhat embarrassed. "I've just placed my order and will be here for another hour or so." "Wonderful," Adriana responded. "My mother and I live nearby. I'll come by in 15 minutes. They ended the call. Antonio felt his heartbeat quicken after this brief conversation. He anxiously and eagerly awaited Adriana's arrival, mentally picturing her. However, when the door to the restaurant opened a quarter of an hour later, he saw someone who far exceeded all his fantasies. Before him stood a beautiful young woman with long chestnut hair, more lovely than anyone he had ever met. The stranger was dressed in a white lace dress, cinched with a brown leather belt, and matching woven sandals. A small bag on a long golden chain was slung over her left shoulder. Antonio stood up, feeling both embarrassed and delighted. The girl immediately noticed him and approached. From this distance, the doctor saw that she had gently blue, almost transparent eyes. "You must be Antonio, right?" she asked. "Yes," the man nodded. "And you're Adriana?" "That's right," the girl smiled. Antonio thought that only angels smiled like that. "Let's sit at my table," he suggested. Adriana nodded, and Antonio, pulling out a chair, helped her to sit. "I came not only to thank you," Adriana began excitedly, "but also because I need to share something with someone. I hope you'll forgive me for this weakness." Antonio was surprised, but didn't ask any questions, allowing Adriana to continue. "Yesterday you were so generous to pay for my mother, whom everyone laughed at. Thank you for that. I must admit, her behavior worries me greatly." "But what's wrong with her?" Antonio asked cautiously. Adriana nervously clasped and then unclasped her hands. "The thing is, in her youth, she went through a very severe tragedy. At the time, she was pregnant with me. I don't know exactly what happened, but it's somehow related to my grandfather and aunt. Mom gave birth to me on time and immediately bonded with me. But she couldn't handle the responsibilities of motherhood, so my aunt took on most of the responsibility for little me." Having said that, Adriana absently picked up a napkin and started twisting it in her hands, seemingly trying to calm her agitation. "As far back as I can remember, my mother was always absent-minded. My aunt said that she could half-dress me, leave me on the changing table, and then go into another room, standing there by the window, gazing at the clouds. That's why my aunt never left me unattended. The older my mother got, the stranger her behavior became. If, in my early childhood, she would retreat into herself for a short period, by the time I was in school, she began to forget so completely that she could leave the house for 2 or 3 hours and then not remember where she had been." Antonio gave Adriana a sympathetic look. "I can imagine how hard it must be for you," he said. He wanted to take her hand to comfort her, but hesitated. "Now that I'm grown up, my mother has completely forgotten who she is now. It's as if she relives every day the period of life that preceded the tragedy. She's going back to the past, where everything was still fine." Antonio guessed. "Yes," Adriana confirmed, trying to smile, but failing. "Oh, how sad," Antonio said softly. Adriana nodded, and her shoulders shuddered. "I've gotten used to it, and yet," she whispered, barely audible. "I understand how difficult this is," Antonio repeated. "Perhaps you'd like something to drink?" I'd like just plain water, Adriana admitted. Antonio called the waitress and asked her to bring a glass of water for his guest. When the girl left, Adriana took a deep breath and continued. When my mother was very young, she and her father used to dine at this restaurant often, she said. And my grandfather always paid for them. Now it all makes sense, Antonio said upon hearing this. Adriana nodded quickly. It's so painful to realize that people mock my mother or, worse, think she's rude and shameless without understanding that her condition is caused by psychological trauma. The waitress brought the water, and Adriana took a few sips to calm herself. Antonio didn't know what to say or how to help her. Don't take it too much to heart, Antonio said, the only thing that came to mind. Yes, of course, Adriana replied. I just love my mother so much and want to protect her from such unpleasant moments. You can't control everything, Antonio wisely said. You'll only destabilize your own nerves. Just let the situation go. The important thing is that your mother's life and health are not in danger, and what others think of her is unimportant. Adriana thoughtfully listened to Antonio's words, looking him in the eyes. Perhaps you're right, she said after a short pause. I do worry too much about what others think. We can never please everyone, Antonio philosophically observed and, laughing, added, and there will always be those who say there's something wrong with us. Adriana joined his laughter. Yes, you're right, she nodded. But I haven't told you the whole story yet. Antonio looked at her in surprise. Then perhaps we could take a walk along the waterfront and talk in the fresh air? Adriana cheerfully nodded. That's a wonderful idea, she agreed. The girl finished her water, and Antonio, in the meantime, paid for his breakfast. They headed to the exit and, moments later, found themselves on a shaded street leading down to the sea. The young people strolled slowly along it. So, what else did you want to tell me? Antonio asked, turning to the girl. A shadow instantly fell over Adriana's face. This part of the story also deeply worries me. After the restaurant, my mother usually goes to the abandoned old theater. Antonio was very surprised again. But why? He asked. Adriana gave him a quick glance. The thing is, before I was born, my mother was an actress. The theater where she performed belonged to my grandfather, and he was the main director. That's why, after the restaurant, it's as if my mother is preparing for an evening performance. I see, Antonio nodded understandingly. At that moment, the young people reached the waterfront, where well-dressed couples were strolling, and a street musician played the flute. The day was hot, despite the fluffy clouds that occasionally drifted across the sun. Fortunately, the curly, gracefully bent pine trees provided pleasant shade. When she does that, I'm very afraid that she might get hurt among the old ruins or that something else might happen to her, Adriana complained. Then why do you let her go by herself? Antonio asked, surprised. Adriana shrugged. My aunt and I try very hard to keep an eye on her, but we don't always succeed. Sometimes she literally escapes from us, coming up with various excuses to slip out of the house. Once, she even sneaked out through a window. Antonio couldn't help but smile. Of course, your mother thinks she's 20 years old. The sea is up to her knees. Adriana couldn't help but smile too. That's the thing, she confirmed. Shall we walk to the abandoned theater? Antonio suggested. We could inspect the building and assess its potential danger to your mother, and then address the issue with the appropriate services. Adriana's face brightened. Oh, that's a good idea, she exclaimed. Let's go, it's not far from here. With that, the enthusiastic girl started walking a little faster. Antonio walked beside her, feeling something special. He hadn't felt so interested in someone's company in a long time. He felt ready to follow Adriana to the ends of the earth. After 10 minutes, they reached the far end of the waterfront and emerged onto a small round square surrounded by trees. In the center was a non-functioning fountain. The paving tiles here were old. In many places, they were covered with deep cracks from which grass was growing. Antonio had never been here before. Why was this place abandoned? It's right in the center of the city, he wondered. This building still belongs to our family, Adriana shivered and confessed. My grandfather died a long time ago, and after him, no one wanted to deal with the theater. As you've probably guessed, my mother is not herself, and my aunt somehow fears continuing my father's work. Was your aunt also an actress? Antonio asked. Yes, she used to shine on stage, but as far as I know, she always got only supporting roles. With that, Adriana lightly kicked a small stone. Your mother was the leading actress, wasn't she? Antonio guessed. That's right, the girl nodded, and there was bitterness in her voice. I think my aunt was a little envious of her sister. Why do you think so? Antonio asked. I can feel it, Adriana answered sadly. The young people fell silent for a while. Antonio looked at the theater building, which had once been majestic and even monumental. Now the columns were cracked, covered with ivy, and the once bright stone had darkened with time. The building looked sadly at the young people with the empty eye sockets of its windows. I think we should get inside and carefully inspect the premises. Adriana hesitantly nodded. She wasn't very eager to enter the long-abandoned theater, but she felt protected with Antonio by her side. The doctor climbed the partially destroyed stairs and pulled open the old heavy door. With a creak, it gave way. He entered first, holding the door for Adriana. In the room that had once been the lobby, there was a damp twilight and silence, only broken by the rustling of the wind coming through the window openings. Adriana shivered, and Antonio wanted to put his arm around her shoulders to comfort her, but he restrained himself. Instead, he gently took her hand and led her up the old staircase. They reached the second floor and through a large opening entered a spacious auditorium with a huge stage. Dust lay thickly on the crimson velvet seats. The stage, once illuminated by bright spotlights, now was engulfed in darkness. Scattered everywhere were remnants of scenery and posters, echoes of long-forgotten performances. The remains of gilded moldings that once adorned the ceiling evoked sad thoughts of past grandeur now gone. Cracks in the walls, like wrinkles on a face, seemed to scream, "Reflect on how you live, for time relentlessly marches on." Antonio felt it hard to breathe, and Adriana's hand was tense, as if it were made of stone. The smell of mustiness and dust, faintly tinged with the scent of perfume, a remnant of long-evaporated emotions, created a unique but heavy atmosphere. I feel like I might hear the voices of ghostly actors, Adriana admitted, shuddering for a moment. Antonio felt the same way. Does your mother come here often? Adriana voiced her unspoken question. But what does she do here? Perhaps she goes on stage and recites her roles? Antonio suggested. Adriana shook her head thoughtfully. I don't think she remembers them, the girl said, then was struck by an idea. Or maybe she goes to the small room that used to be her dressing room. Encouraged by her guess, Adriana grabbed Antonio's hand and pulled him toward the stage. The steps creaked beneath them but seemed sturdy and safe. I don't think there's any danger for her here, Adriana said, leading Antonio behind the stage. Let's find her dressing room, it should be somewhere around here. The young people stepped into the corridor and walked along it, peeking into every door. Finally, they noticed a plaque with a name. Beatrice, Antonio read aloud. That's my mother's name, Adriana said and pushed open the door, which was not locked. Inside, they found a small table with a large mirror in a heavy frame and a chair whose legs were long covered with cobwebs. Through a small window, which still had glass, slanted sunbeams filtered in. It's surprising that the interior items are still here, Antonio remarked. Adriana silently nodded in response. She gently touched the lacquered surface of the table, then carefully sat in the chair, apparently imagining her young mother sitting here. Exhaling, she grasped the handle of the long drawer with both hands and pulled it open. Inside were dusty bottles of long-evaporated perfume, empty powder jars, and yellowed posters. Adriana examined the drawer's contents without touching the items when Antonio noticed that something in the far corner had caught her attention. Adriana leaned slightly and pulled out a bundle of envelopes tied with a faded satin ribbon. "What's this?" Antonio asked, moving a bit closer. "Apparently, old letters," Adriana replied, carefully brushing dust off the top envelope. She scrutinized the yellowed paper, trying to make out the letters. "It says my mother's name," she said after a few moments. "These letters belonged to her." Antonio looked at the girl with skepticism. "Do you want to read them?" he asked. "I think so," Adriana nodded, giving him a confident look. "I understand that it might not be entirely ethical, but I want to uncover my mother's secret. I want to understand what happened and why she went mad." Antonio nodded in understanding. "If it's that important, you should read them." Adriana looked at him with gratitude. "I don't think we should take them home," the girl said after some hesitation. "I'll open the top one and read it right here, if you don't mind." "I'll wait for you," Antonio replied. Adriana nodded and, carefully untying the ribbon, pulled out the top envelope from the stack. It was open, and she easily retrieved a folded, yellowed piece of paper from it. "Beloved and dearly loved Beatrice," Adriana read aloud and, swallowing nervously, delved into the reading. Here's what was written in the letter. "Beloved and dearly loved Beatrice, I know that your father does not want to see us together, but I love you more than life itself and want to be with you. Yesterday, when you played Isabella in the Lilac Night, I nearly lost my mind from tenderness for you and admiration for your talent. I applauded louder than anyone in the hall. I noticed that your father turned to me and steadied me with a piercing, scrutinizing gaze. Yes, he definitely does not like me, and I don't even know why he chose me to play Romeo, your stage lover. It was after that performance, where we played together, that I developed the most elevated and at the same time passionate feelings for you. Yes, I honestly admit, even then I began to dream that one day you would become my lawful wife, and we would build our own home and have 2 children. However, all my dreams turned to dust when I told your father everything. Of course, you heard how he yelled at me. Yes, he was furious and disgracefully expelled me from his theater. Now I write you this letter under the cover of night. Beloved, I swear that I still want to be with you and will never leave you. Do you want the same? If so, we can run far, far away from here, to a place where no one will ever find us. There we will start a new life. We will join another theater, and you will again play leading roles, for you are such a brilliant actress. If you agree, send me a message. Your faithful and devoted Bernardo." After reading the letter, Adriana quickly relayed its contents to Antonio. "It seems we've found the key to your mother's mystery," the man said. "A tragic love and separation." Adriana nodded thoughtfully. "But Bernardo didn't give up when my grandfather expelled him from the theater. Perhaps my mother was simply scared and refused to run away with him?" Antonio stroked his chin. "Yes, that might be the case. And then she could have regretted it. And gone mad with remorse?" Adriana said skeptically. "I find it hard to believe such a thing happens." "Yes, you're right. It's more likely she suffered from prolonged depression, but not madness," Antonio said. Adriana stood up from the chair. "So there was something more." Antonio nodded toward the envelopes in her hand. "Maybe you'll find the answer in the other letters?" he asked. But Adriana shook her head. "No, I already checked, and the dates on the other envelopes are older. The letter I read was the last one." "Meaning?" Antonio asked, still not fully grasping Adriana's thought. She shook her head decisively. "Meaning, I need to have a serious talk with my aunt. She's my mother's older sister and surely knows something about this whole situation." "Yes, that makes sense," Antonio agreed with Adriana. She returned the yellowed letters to the drawer and slid it back into the desk. Then she and Antonio left the old dressing room and retraced their steps to the theater exit. "Shall I walk you home?" Antonio offered when they finally reached the street and, squinting in the bright sunlight, breathed in the fresh sea air. "You've already done so much for me," the girl replied gratefully. I feel uncomfortable taking up so much of your precious time. Antonio smiled at her words. Not at all, I'm happy to help you, he said. And I have the day off anyway. Adriana looked into his eyes. I'm sorry, I've been thinking only about myself and my mother's story and didn't even ask what you do. I'm such a selfish person, Adriana lamented. Don't be hard on yourself, Antonio said. In your situation, anyone would act the same way. They slowly walked back to the restaurant where they had met a couple of hours earlier. So, what do you do? Adriana asked with a sweet smile. And how long have you been living in our town? I almost immediately realized you weren't local. Oh, now you're bombarding me with questions. Antonio laughed, slightly embarrassed. But I'm happy to answer them. Yes, I've been living in your lovely town for just 3 months. I moved here from the capital. I work at a surgical clinic nearby. Really? Adriana exclaimed. So you're a doctor? Yes, Antonio confirmed. And I really love my job. That's wonderful, the girl simply responded. They continued chatting about various topics and soon arrived at Adriana's home. It was a small cottage with an old garden full of fruit trees. This is where we live, Adriana said. What a charming place, Antonio remarked. He felt he was reluctant to say goodbye to the girl. May I ask for your phone number? He asked shyly. I'd like to know how your mother's love story with the mysterious Bernardo, who adored her so, turns out. Adriana smiled and nodded. Of course, she said simply. They exchanged phone numbers, and Adriana went through the gate, waving goodbye to Antonio. He joyfully waved back, feeling very happy. The man eagerly awaited the evening to call Adriana. He not only wanted to learn the continuation of the story, but also to hear her voice. When Adriana finally answered the phone, Antonio thought she sounded a bit sleepy. Sorry if I'm disturbing you, he said. It's okay, the girl quickly replied. I just dozed off a bit after all the emotions I went through today. Sorry again for bothering you, Antonio repeated. There's no need to apologize, Adriana responded, and he could hear her smile. I needed to wake up anyway. And now I want to take a walk along the waterfront. May I join you? Antonio offered. I'd be very happy to see you again, Adriana admitted. And to tell you everything I learned about my mother from my aunt. Great. Then I'll come by your house in half an hour, the man asked. Yes, that's just enough time for me to get ready, Adriana replied. Exactly half an hour later, the young people met again and set off on their second walk to the sea that long day. So, what did you find out? Antonio asked. He was delighted to see the girl again and was burning with curiosity, eager for her story. When I got home, Adriana began, adjusting her bangs. My aunt was there. I invited her for coffee on the veranda, and she agreed. Once we settled in the wicker chairs, I started carefully asking her about the past. She told me about the plays she was in and how much she enjoyed them. I learned a lot about my grandfather and his work as a director. But my aunt consistently avoided topics related to her sister. She didn't want to tell you about your mother? Antonio asked. No, Adriana shook her head. Then I directly asked my aunt if she knew an actor named Bernardo who once performed in my grandfather's theater. And what did she say? Antonio asked with interest. Adriana paused for a moment, as if catching her breath, then continued. At first, my aunt hesitated. It was clear she didn't want to talk about it. But then I pressed on and told her I had read his letter addressed to my mother. Adriana paused again, and Antonio felt she needed his support. He took her hand, and she looked at him gratefully. When my aunt heard this, she started crying, Adriana said bitterly. And she told me the whole truth. At that moment, they reached a beautiful statue of two lovers surrounded by benches, and Antonio suggested sitting on one. Adriana nodded with excitement. Maybe I should get some water, the man asked with concern. No, I'm fine, Adriana replied and continued her story. My aunt said that when Bernardo wrote that letter, she accidentally entered my mother's dressing room and read it. Fearing that her sister would make a mistake and run away, and also feeling envious, she told everything to my father. He was furious but realized he couldn't force his younger daughter to stay. So he decided to be cunning and made a deal with my aunt to deceive her sister. But how? Antonio was astonished. "Oh, this is the worst part," Adriana exclaimed. My aunt told my mother that she had been secretly meeting Bernardo. "Good heavens!" Antonio gasped. A couple passing by cast curious glances at him and giggled, but he paid them no mind. He was completely focused on Adriana's words. "Did Beatrice believe her?" he asked. Adriana nodded sadly. "Yes, she believed it, and it broke her heart. My aunt still can't forgive herself for this." "And that's when she lost her sanity?" Antonio asked cautiously. Adriana shook her head. "No, that happened later when my mother found out that Bernardo had died." Antonio couldn't believe what he was hearing. He couldn't bear that my mother no longer wanted to see him. He drank a lot, and then he was hit by a car. "How awful," Antonio said. They were silent for a moment, then the man went over to a street vendor and bought a bottle of mineral water for Adriana. She accepted it gratefully and, unscrewing the cap, took a few sips. "Thank you, Antonio. You really understand me. You're going through a tough time, and I can see that," the man replied. Adriana gathered her strength and continued. "At first, my mother was angry with her lover, but when she learned he had died, she was devastated. That was when she realized she was pregnant. My mother knew she had to live for me, but the shock she experienced had already left an indelible mark on her mind. My aunt told me that my mother constantly talked to Bernardo as if he were still with her. That's how the slow decline of her sanity began." "What a sad story," Antonio said softly. Adriana just sighed in response. "Grandfather couldn't forgive himself for his treachery either," she said, looking at the distant horizon. "He died very early because he was constantly tormented by guilt." "I'm so sorry," the man whispered. "I'm thinking of visiting his grave and laying white flowers there as a sign that no one holds anything against him. May his soul rest in peace." Antonio covered Adriana's hand with his. "If you don't mind, I could go with you," he said. Adriana looked into his eyes thoughtfully, then shook her head. "No, I don't mind. I would appreciate your company. You're such a sensitive listener, it's a rarity." "Thank you, Adriana." The young people sat silently for a while, watching the sun slowly hide behind the edge of the sea, painting it in the sky in shades of pink. After visiting the cemetery together, they continued to meet almost every day. They found new topics to talk about, but the old story that brought them together forever bonded them, creating a strong, trusting connection. Talking with Adriana, Antonio no longer felt lonely. He felt that the girl was getting the support she needed from him, which made him happy. Each day, they grew closer to each other. One day, Antonio suggested going somewhere with Adriana and her mother, and the girl gladly agreed. Of course, Beatrice was a bit distant and quiet, but Antonio felt she enjoyed their company. He decided to make their outings together a nice tradition. Gradually, the young people became almost like family to each other, and Antonio began to think about proposing to Adriana. He wanted the moment to be special. He spent a long time visiting jewelry stores in search of a unique ring that would suit his beloved. Finally, in one of the tiny shops, he accidentally noticed a ring with a blue stone resembling a forget-me-not flower. Without hesitation, he bought it. The old jeweler carefully placed the delicate item in a beautiful velvet box, and Antonio thanked him sincerely. Antonio decided to propose to Adriana by the sea at sunset. The next day, he invited her for a walk, and she happily agreed. They strolled leisurely along the waterfront when Adriana suddenly noticed a pod of dolphins swimming on the horizon. "They're so free and happy," the girl sighed. "How I wish I could go on a carefree journey like a dolphin, forgetting everything in the world." "With me?" Antonio asked with a smile. Of course, dear, Adriana replied without hesitation. Antonio hugged her tightly and spun her around. Then he stopped, set Adriana down on the ground, knelt, and pulled the box with the ring from his pocket. My beloved, will you be my wife? Antonio asked with a pounding heart. I promise to take you wherever you want and will gladly fulfill all your heart's desires. Adriana couldn't believe her eyes. Oh, Antonio, she said, feeling tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. Of course, I will be your wife. Antonio placed the ring on her finger and, rising to his feet, hugged and kissed her tightly. Passers-by smiled as they watched, and some even took photos. A little boy brought Adriana a bouquet of forget-me-nots, and the girl thanked him warmly. I will never forget this happy moment, she whispered to Antonio. You are the best in the world. The wedding day was sunny but not hot. The sea delighted the eye with all shades of azure and turquoise. On the deck of the rented boat stood an arch decorated with white roses and forget-me-nots. Antonio, in an elegant suit, waited anxiously for his beloved. Adriana, who appeared before him in a flowing white wedding dress like a sea wave, looked stunning. Family and friends of Antonio and Adriana came to share this happy day with them. Among them were Antonio's patients and former colleagues from the capital. When Adriana approached the altar, her eyes shone with happiness. Antonio could not hold back his tears as he looked at his beloved. She had become a ray of light that illuminated his life after long years of loneliness. The ceremony was simple but touching. The priest's words about love and fidelity sounded like a gentle melody of the wind. After Antonio and Adriana were declared husband and wife, the guests gathered at the festive table, which was also decorated with flowers. Laughter and jokes filled the air. Antonio and Adriana, gazing into each other's eyes, danced the first dance as newlyweds. When the man returned to the table, one of his friends, who was a doctor from the capital, quietly approached him. I think your wife's mother might have some issues, he said. Antonio just nodded in response. Beatrice was sitting next to Adriana, with a confused but happy smile on her face. I can try to help her, Antonio's friend offered. Antonio looked at him gratefully. Thank you, my friend. I would be very grateful. The friend just nodded in reply. I still remember how you saved my daughter when she had appendicitis. That was the case, Antonio said seriously. The friends patted each other on the back and raised their glasses of champagne in a toast to the health of everyone present. Then Antonio looked tenderly at Adriana and whispered softly in her ear. You are my happiness. Adriana smiled radiantly at him in response. And you are mine, she whispered. I'm so glad we met on this vast planet. Antonio said. I'm also happy that you decided to move to my tiny town one day, Adriana replied affectionately. They kissed, and the guests began throwing rose petals at them and singing loudly. A year later, Antonio and Adriana had a son, whom they named Mario. He was a strong and healthy baby. Beatrice started receiving careful treatment from Antonio's friend, and it began to show results. Adriana's mother could now recognize her daughter and her son-in-law and understand what was happening around her. Reality had returned to her, coloring her life with new hues. Beatrice now found joy in seeing her dearest loved ones around her. She, Adriana, and Mario often walked along the shore, and these moments always left them with a quiet sense of peace. The young wife was very happy with Antonio, who always understood her with half a word and doted on their child.
All right, everyone's presentations are done. Nick, the manager, said as he tried to move the discussion forward. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me and began to speak. There's apparently someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. His lackey, Mike, of course, agreed with Nick. I'm leaving. After leaving the meeting room, I started to shut down my computer. I noticed that an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking, there's no point in speaking up, no one will listen, I went home quietly. The next day, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. He was staring at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick! Is something wrong? Mike looked at the screen with him. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Knowing the reason for Mike's distress, I thought to myself, serves them right. My name is Adam. My mother passed away when I was in the 9th grade, and I was raised by my father. Well, you could hardly call it being raised. After my mother passed, my father changed. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, and though he still went to work, he squandered our living expenses on horse racing. Because of that, I had to start working part-time as soon as I entered high school. Every month, I went to the convenience store with bills in hand that couldn't be auto-deducted from my father's account. Even though I endured it because I didn't want to be alone, I reached my limit in my 2nd year of high school and dropped out. I found a live-in job at a distant inn. Thank you for everything. The day I left home, my father, still staring at the TV, spoke. Take care. That was our last conversation. Back then, 18 wasn't the age of majority, so I needed my father's permission to work, and I couldn't hide my place of employment. Yet, my father never visited me even once. I kept working just to survive, and before I knew it, I was 42. Years of hard work paid off, and I was transferred to the headquarters. I was thrilled to be recognized by the company, as I thought I'd be working in the field until retirement due to my lack of formal education. Listen up. Our work can change the future of our employees. Don't drag us down. On my first day after the transfer, Nick, dressed in an expensive suit, spoke sternly. There was a reason for this. Our inn was located in a prominent tourist destination, known so well that everyone in the state could sing its commercial jingle. At its peak, we had 5 locations within the state. But that was long ago. Due to financial difficulties and aging facilities, only the place where I had worked for many years and the original establishment remained. I was prepared to lose my job anytime, but now there was a glimmer of hope. With the rise of social media, the tourist area where the inn was located started gaining attention again. Depending on how hard the sales department, where I was transferred, worked. We could either thrive or be forced to give up this prime location to the new hotel chains continuously popping up. For Nick, who had switched careers from another industry to strengthen our sales, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. I understood why he had to be strict. I will do my best. Nick sneered at my enthusiastic declaration. Did you not hear what I said? I'm sorry. I thought I was listening carefully. Out of habit from years of customer service, I apologized reflexively, though I had no idea what had offended him. Someone was watching me with a smirk. In this department, there are those who are expected to excel and those who have been shoved here because they have nowhere else to go. You are the latter. It was Mike, the section chief. He's 7 years younger, at 35. But he was called to headquarters much earlier than I was and had been moving around within the headquarters ever since. I'm not jealous, but I can't accept that he's my boss. Graduating from a prestigious university, he has an unusually high pride and caused many problems as a newbie, making things very difficult for me when I was the front desk leader. When I found out Mike was transferred to the sales department a month before me, I was disheartened. Mike is right. With just a middle school diploma, there's not much you can do. Don't even think about achieving results. As if I didn't exist, Nick remarked, I'm thirsty. Mike eagerly ran to the coffee maker. It seems Mike is Nick's lackey. I regretted being happy about my transfer to headquarters, wishing I had stayed on site forever. Send a direct mail to every company on this list by the end of the day. Nick only assigned me tasks that even a new graduate could handle. What? There are over 1,000 companies. You want me to send to all of them by today? Yes, if you and your fellow misfits split the work, even those with nowhere else to go should finish by today. I glanced at the employees typing away expressionlessly. They were worn out from customer service, only thinking about leaving on time, or were women reassigned after having children, with zero motivation for work. Even Sam, a new graduate from the same university as Mike, who was supposed to be among the expected achievers, had no enthusiasm for the job. Having joined the company wanting to do customer service. I don't care what they say, I plan to quit anytime, he said. Only Nick and Mike were highly motivated, making all the decisions between the two of them. I originally only wanted to work at the inn to survive and had no particular attachment to this job. I swallowed my words, thinking I had no right to reprimand them. About a month after the transfer, Nick told us with a frustrated look. To commemorate the 50th anniversary, we've decided to create a plan exclusive for one group per day. Originally, Mike and I were supposed to come up with it, but our president, Mr. Thompson, insists on hearing everyone's opinions. So, you all get a chance. As Nick explained, Mike began handing out prints. Make sure not to embarrass Nick. If your ideas are half-baked, you'll have to redo them. It seemed that they had printed his handwritten notes by Mr. Thompson, which included several questions and a section for free responses. It made sense why Nick had to seek our input, given that all responses had to be submitted to Mr. Thompson. We were given a week to think about it, and a meeting was scheduled to compile our ideas. My plan is to let guests enjoy both the old and modern America. Nick began the presentations. Guests would watch a master confectioner at a nearby traditional sweet shop make sweets in front of them. The welcome drink would be premium tea in a bottle. Nick's plan was certainly attractive. After his presentation, Nick called on us to present in the order we were seated. Just as I stood up for my turn. All right, everyone's presentations are done. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me. There's someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. He was likely talking about me. I joined the company as a part-timer and was made a full-time employee when I turned 20. That was 20 years ago, so Nick and Mike probably had no chance to know until recently. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. After that, Nick kept creating opportunities to solicit everyone's opinions, purposefully excluding me from speaking. The meeting unexpectedly heated up and went past the scheduled end time. A few people asked to leave, and the discussion continued with the remaining few. Still here? Normally, you'd leave in that situation. Though I had no attachment to the job initially, hearing kind words from customers made me want to make them happier. For someone like me, with nowhere to go, the inn was my home and customer service was my life. I felt pathetic about my current self. I'm leaving. I left the conference room and started shutting down my computer. I noticed an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking no one would listen to what I had to say anyway, I quietly went home. The next day, while preparing the DM as instructed, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. In his haste to stand up, he hit his knee on the desk. He stared at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick! What's wrong? Mike, thinking he should be the first to rush over, approached Nick while still wearing his coat. He peered at the screen with Nick. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Who is responsible for this company? Nick, more irritated than ever, asked, and Mike answered without checking. Probably Sam. Sam wasn't there because he was attending a morning training session for new hires. Nick gave up on getting angry and returned his gaze to the screen. They were looking at an email that arrived right after the end of the working day yesterday. Apparently, no one, including me, had checked it before leaving. The email was from a large company that used us for their annual employee trips. The president and executives of that company also frequently used our services personally. President of the company, Mr. Mason himself, had declared that neither he nor his company would ever use our services again. Well, some companies cancel their employee trips or stop using our services due to financial struggles. Let's just move on. Mike kept wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Knowing why Mike was so agitated, I quietly watched their interaction. Do you know how much revenue we get from that company? We can find other guests to fill the rooms, but we'll lose the banquet costs, gift shop revenue, rental car fees, and more. Moreover, the gifts were supposed to be prepared by the traditional confectionery shop involved in Nick's proposed plan. If it's known that we incurred such a huge loss at this critical time, Nick's position in the company would be jeopardized. Nick took a deep breath, seemingly trying to calm himself. All right, Mike. Go to New York right now and apologize to Mr. Mason. What? You're coming with me, right? I have urgent work to do. I trust you, which is why I'm entrusting this to you. Please. Mike, believing Nick's sincerity, agreed with a determined look on his face, saying, yes. That's Nick for you. Even if Mike went to apologize, Nick would shift all the blame onto him if the client didn't change their mind. Well, it was Mike's fault to begin with, so it served him right. About 3 hours later, Sam answered a call from somewhere and repeatedly apologized, saying, I'm very sorry. Everyone watched to see what was happening. After ending the call, he informed Nick with a weary tone. When Mike arrived at the client's company, he only made things worse, further infuriating Mr. Mason. He was demanding, get his boss here immediately. It was no wonder Sam was exhausted, dealing with such a call right after returning from training. What is that idiot doing? All right, Adam, you're coming with me. If sacrificing Mike didn't work, then I must be next. Normally, I'd want to refuse at all costs, but I saw an opportunity in this situation. If I can be of assistance, I'd be happy to join you. I immediately followed Nick, and we flew to New York. When we introduced ourselves at the reception, it became clear how serious the situation was. As the receptionist personally escorted us to the president's office. Angry voices leaked through the door, making both Nick and me uneasy. Excuse me. I'm Nick, the supervisor. I understand my subordinate has caused you trouble, and I deeply apologize. Nick, with his experience in the corporate world, knew enough to offer an apology before excuses. However, his customer service skills left much to be desired. I sighed as I saw Mike trembling like a small dog in the corner of the room. What kind of training are you giving your subordinates? Mr. Mason glared at Nick with a red face. The intensity of his gaze made even Nick take a step back. Regrettably, I joined this company only 2 years ago and was unaware of Mike's issues. I should have identified his shortcomings sooner. Indeed. I should have realized sooner. No sensible person would come to apologize and then give a lengthy presentation on the drawbacks of not using their in. Nick froze, his mouth slightly open. Suspecting the worst, I picked up the documents that had fallen to the floor. It seemed Mike hastily prepared these documents on the plane, listing the disadvantages. Disadvantage 1: if you change the venue for the company trip, employees might suspect it's for cost-cutting reasons, leading to a negative impression. Reading it aloud half-jokingly, Nick snatched the papers from my hand and checked the contents with a furious expression. Among the stack of documents was a receipt from a nearby convenience store's copy machine. I felt a pang of dread, hoping he hadn't shown the receipt as well. What do you think he said when I asked what kind of nerve he had to do this? I'm very sorry. Faced with the dire situation, Nick must have thought there was nothing left to do but apologize. In a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from him, he uttered words of apology. He said, I'm a Harvard graduate. I don't believe I said anything wrong. Mike! What have you done? Forgetting his plan to pin the blame on Mike, Nick yelled loudly, even in front of Mr. Mason. I didn't do anything wrong. You're still saying that? Look at him. Mike pointed at me with a shaking hand. I was assigned to headquarters in my 20s and now I'm a section chief. This guy only made it to headquarters at 42. Everything I've done proves I was right. So why are we losing the contract? Having said his piece, Mike collapsed to the floor. Of course. You were sent there because you had nowhere else to go. Mike never expected to hear such words from someone he looked down upon. He lunged at me, and Nick hurriedly stepped in to stop him. Mr. Thompson told me Mike is a quick thinker, and to take good care of him. There's no way he was pushed aside. Don't make things worse here. He didn't say quick thinker, he said only quick-witted, didn't he? I don't remember that part. I recalled the many troubles Mike caused when he was a newbie. When Mike was on the front line, his pride was so high that he never apologized to customers. Customer service, especially in our job, doesn't work alone. It brings both good and bad situations. If the front staff or housekeepers made mistakes, or the cleaning company didn't properly clean a room, one had to apologize to the customers regardless of personal fault. Mike, in such situations, would never apologize, insisting he wasn't at fault. This often angered customers, and as the front desk leader, I frequently had to apologize on his behalf. He caused complaints and disrupted operations, which is why he was quickly moved to headquarters. In departments where he didn't interact directly with customers, his quick thinking was beneficial and things went well. But it seemed his flaws were starting to show. Corporate reservations are supposed to be entered into the system by the sales representative. But a quick check yesterday revealed that more than 10 items were missing from the client's reservation. The handover document clearly stated what needed to be prepared. Why didn't you enter it into the system? Why do we have to give them special treatment? Filling rooms near the banquet hall, setting up all the food in advance. Specifying the brand of wine, they're too demanding. No wonder he always angered customers, I thought, feeling a headache coming on. Grouping them in rooms near the banquet hall is for our benefit too. It makes it easier for the staff to set up beds and serve breakfast since everyone's schedule is synchronized. As for the other requests, Mr. Mason suggested them to lighten our load. I didn't know that. Nick finally seemed to realize that Mike was the one who had angered the client. What did you say to them? I just told them we wouldn't give them special treatment anymore. We shouldn't waste effort on things that don't bring in money. I was utterly exasperated at his lack of understanding of customer service. Of course, we shouldn't comply with unreasonable demands. But carrying over successful practices from past stays makes customers feel remembered and enhances their experience. Good memories encourage repeat visits. That's part of our job. I looked down at Mike, who was sitting on the floor. In our job, nothing is a waste. Mr. Thompson likely moved you to the sales department, hoping you'd finally understand this. How do you think he feels now that you've failed to meet his expectations? Mike, tears in his eyes, fled the president's office. I was amazed he still hadn't apologized. You have it tough, Adam. It's okay, we're all employees of the same company. I deeply apologize for this disrespectful incident. Especially after all the care you've shown us. If it weren't for you, Adam, I really would have stopped staying here. When I heard you were moving to the sales department, I was willing to reconsider if you handled it. Seeing us talk so amicably, Nick's face contorted. Do you two know each other? Adam's service is excellent. I always requested him specifically. Normally, we don't accept specific staff requests, but we made an exception for Mr. Mason, adjusting my shifts accordingly. He had personally stayed at our hotel just before my transfer, and during casual conversation, I mentioned, I'm moving to the sales department soon. If I hadn't told him then, things could have been much worse. Please continue to take care of us. I look forward to it. On the return flight, Nick awkwardly offered me a can of beer. It's still working hours. Of course, I had no intention of forgiving him for a single beer. Nick might try to pin everything on Mike and avoid any consequences. While pondering this, a startling fact came to light. Nick, the tea bottles for the plan have arrived. I handed Nick a bottle labeled with our inn's name. They look good. What are you talking about? These are plastic bottles. I had assumed we would use the trendy, high-end bottling tea. But what arrived were ordinary plastic bottles of tea with customized labels. The only unique aspect was the label, which had the inn's name, making it look customized. Upon further investigation, I discovered that a substantial amount of money was set to be paid to the tea company. It was priced like bottling tea. Does this plastic bottle really cost $100 each? The tea inside is specially blended for us. The extra cost is for that. Wouldn't it be better to use another tea company? Or is there a specific reason we must use this one? As Nick continued to make excuses, I showed him a printed email. I informed the tea company's president, Mr. Mitchell, that we discovered irregular payments and he confessed. He said you two were high school classmates and planned to split the extra money. That idiot. Why did he confess? That's not important. You should worry about yourself, this could turn into a police matter. Opening the bottle cap, I suggested. How about calming down with this tea? It supposedly has a relaxing effect. Nick drank the tea frantically. In the following days, decisions were made about their fates. Mike was reassigned to the General Affairs Department, with no chance of transfer or promotion, as per Mr. Thompson's orders. As for Nick, since the payment to the tea company hadn't yet been made, he narrowly avoided legal trouble. Instead, he was encouraged to leave the company, and to avoid further complications, Nick submitted his resignation. Rumor has it that connections between HR departments have made it difficult for him to find new employment. Even though it was good to have those two gone, something unexpected happened in the sales department. Everyone became motivated and united in refining the 50th anniversary plan. In the end, my plan was adopted. We collaborated with the Tourist Information Center to provide personalized guides. The plan, tailored to the number of guests, was truly special for the 50th anniversary. "Hey, is Adam's family coming to stay?" I immediately booked that special plan for my family. Sam noticed it on the reservation list and quickly picked up on it. "Yes, I'm inviting my father." "That's great. I might invite my parents too." I lacked the courage to face my father just as Adam. But here, with the confidence Mr. Mason praised, I felt ready. The 50th anniversary plan was a perfect opportunity to reconnect with my father. I hoped to bring back the days when we could laugh together as we once did.